And we're going to continue with the second chapter of Mary Poppins Opens the Door by P.L. Travers. This chapter is called Mr. Twigley's Wishes, and we have just met Mr. Twigley, Mary Poppins' cousin Fred, who is a piano tuner, but also has a magic wishing ability. He has just begun to show those wishes off to Jane and Michael. "Of course it is," twinkled Mr. Twigley, and gaily seizing the children's hands, he swept them away across the attic. The three little platforms turned and spun, and the three tunes mingled in the air. "London Bridge is falling down, dance over my lady lay," sang Michael. "Oranges and lemons," said the bells of St. Clement's, sang Jane. And Mr. Twigley whistled like a happy blackbird. The feet of the children were light as wings as they danced to their own true music. Never before, they told themselves, had they felt so light and merry. Bang! The front door slammed and shook the house. Mr. Twigley paused on one toe and listened. Thump, thump came the footsteps on the stairs. A loud voice rumbled across the landing. Mr. Twigley gave a gasp of horror and swung his coat-tails over his ears. "She's coming!" he shrieked. "Oh dear, oh my! I wish I were in a nice, safe place." A blast of music came from the trumpets, and then a strange thing happened. Mr. Twigley, as though by an unseen hand, was snatched from the floor of the attic. Off he went, hurtled past the children like a seed of thistledown, tossed by the wind. Then, choking and gasping, shaking and panting, he landed upon his musical box. He did not seem to have grown any smaller, nor the box larger, but somehow they fitted perfectly together. Round and round Mr. Twigley spun, and upon his face spread a smile of triumph. "I'm safe!" he yelled, as he waved to the children. "They'll never catch me now. Or she'll never catch me now. Hooray!" They were just about to shout, but the word was caught in their throats like a hiccup, for something had seized them by the hair and was flinging them both across the attic. Their arms and legs went sprawling wildly, and they landed upon their musical boxes. They waddled for a little moment, but soon they were steadily whirring around. "Oh!" panted Jane. "What a lovely surprise!" "I feel like a spinning top!" shouted Michael. Mr. Twigley gave a little start and stared at them in astonishment. "Did I do that? Good gracious me! I'm getting quite clever at wishing." "Clever?" said Mary Poppins. "Ridiculous is what I call it." "Well, at least it's safe," said Mr. Twigley, "and rather pleasant. Why don't you try it?" "Wish," urged Michael with a wave of his hands. "Ah, she doesn't need to," said Mr. Twigley with a curious glance at Mary Poppins. "Well, if you insist," she said with a sniff. And, placing her 2 feet neatly together, she rose from the floor and swept past the rafters. Then, without a smile, not even a wobble, she alighted upon a musical box. Immediately, though no one had wound it, the tune broke gaily out. Round and round the cobbler's bench the monkey chased the weasel. The monkey said it was all in fun. Pop goes the weasel. It sang, and round went Mary Poppins as calmly as though she had turned and spun from the very day she was born. "Now we're all together!" Jane cried happily. She glanced at the window and waved her hand to draw Michael's attention. Outside, in the street, the little houses were revolving on their foundations. Above, in the sky, spun 2 white clouds, and the attic itself, like the musical boxes, was turning round and round. But loudly, though the 4 tunes rang, another sound could be heard above them. Thump, thump, the heavy steps came nearer, and the next moment somebody banged on the door. "Open, I say, in the name of the law!" cried a voice that was somehow familiar. A strong hand twisted the rickety lock, and then, with a crash, the door burst open. On the threshold stood Mrs. Clump and the policeman. They stared, their eyes popped, their mouths fell open with astonishment. "Well, of all the shameful sights!" cried Mrs. Clump. "I never thought I'd see the house turned into an amusement park." She shook her fist at Mary Poppins. "You're going to get your reward, my girl. The policeman here will deal with you. And as for you, Mr. Twigley, down you get from that silly razzle-dazzle and comb your hair and put on your hat. We are going off to be married." Mr. Twigley shuddered, but he swung his coat-tails jauntily. "Don't shout and thump, please, Mrs. Clump. It makes me jump," he sang as he sped round. The policeman took out notebook and pencil. Go on, stop spinning, all of you. I'm as giddy as a garden goat. And I want an explanation. Mr. Twigley gave a gleeful chuckle. You've come to the wrong place, officer dear. I've never yet made an explanation. And what's more, as I used to say to my boy Methuselah, I don't believe in 'em. Now, joking will only make things worse. You can't tell me you're Methuselah's father. The policeman smiled a knowing smile. Grandfather, Mr. Twigley retorted as he sailed gracefully round. Now that's enough. You just come down. This spinning and twirling is bad for the health, and not permitted in private dwellings here. Ooh, that's pulling me. Let me go. The policeman gave a frightened shriek as he shot off his feet through the air. A music box broke into a noisy song as he dropped like a stone upon it. Daisy, Daisy, give me your answer due. I've gone crazy, all for the love of you. It shouted, help, help, it's me PC-32 calling. The policeman wildly snatched at his whistle and blew a resounding blast. Officer, shouted Mrs. Clump. You do your duty or I'll have the law on you too. Get down and arrest that woman. She thrust a huge finger at Mary Poppins. I'll have you put behind bars, my girl. I'll have you. Here, stop spinning me round. Her eyes grew wide with angry amazement, for a curious thing was happening. Slowly, on the spot where she stood, Mrs. Clump began to revolve. She had no musical box, no platform. She simply went round and round on the floor. The boards gave a loud protesting creak as the huge shape turned upon them. Well, that's fixed you, cried Mr. Twigley. Try and jump, dear Mrs. Clump, he advised her with a gleeful shriek. A shudder of horror shook Mrs. Clump as she tried to move her large black boots. She struggled, she writhed, she wriggled her body, but her feet were firmly glued to the floor. Clever girl, Mary, I'd never have thought of it. Mr. Twigley smiled at Mary Poppins with pride and admiration. This is your doing. This is your doing, you willful, wicked, cold-hearted varmint! Mrs. Clump gave an angry shout as she tried to clutch at Mary Poppins. I'll get even with you, even if my name's not... I will get even with you yet, or my name's not Sarah Clump! It'll never be Twigley, anyway, shrieked Mr. Twigley joyously. I want to go home. I want the police station, wailed the policeman, spinning madly. Well, nobody's keeping you, I'm sure, said Mary Poppins, sniffing. As she spoke, the policeman's box came to a standstill, and he stumbled off it, panting. Scotland Yard, he cried, staggering to the door. I must see the chief. I must make a report. And blowing a frantic peal on his whistle, he fled downstairs and came out of the house. Come back, you villain, screamed Mrs. Clump. He's gone, she went on, as the front door banged. Oh, what shall I do? Help, murder, fire! Her face grew red as she tried to free herself, but it was no good. Her feet were firmly fixed on the floor, and she flung out her arms with a cry of anguish. Mr. Twigley, she begged, please help me, sir. I've always cooked you tasty meals. I've always kept you clean and tidy. You won't have to marry me, I promise, if you'll only wish something to set me free. Be careful, Fred, warned Mary Poppins as she twirled in a dignified manner. A wish in time saves 9. Now let me think, murmured Mr. Twigley. He pressed his fingers to his eyes. Jane and Michael could see he was making an effort to wish something really useful. For a moment, he spun round, deep in thought. Then he looked up smiling and clapped his hands. Mrs. Clump, he cried gaily, you shall be free. I wish for you a golden palace and peacock pie every day for dinner, but... He winked across at Mary Poppins. My kind of palace, Mrs. Clump, and my kind of pie. A roll of drums boomed through the attic. Mrs. Clump looked at Mary Poppins and smiled a smile of triumph. Aha, she said smugly. What did I tell you? But even as she spoke, the proud smile faded. It changed to a look of purest terror, for Mrs. Clump was no longer a large, fat woman. Her buxom body was rapidly shrinking. Her feet, as they spun on the creaking floor, grew smaller with every turn. What's this? She panted. Oh, what could it be? Her arms and legs grew short and skinny as her finger dwindled to half its size. Police! Fire! Murder! SOS! Her voice grew thinner as she shrank. Oh, Mr. Twigley, what have you done? Police! Police! Squeaked the tiny voice. As she spoke, the floor gave an angry heave and flung her, spinning into the air. She bounced back with a frantic shriek and stumbled away across the room. And as she ran, she grew smaller than ever, and her movements more and more jerky. One moment she was the size of a kitten, the next no bigger than a small-sized mouse. Away she went, stumbling and bouncing and tripping, till, at the end of the attic, she dashed into a tiny golden palace that had suddenly appeared. Excuse me. Oh, why did I speak up to him? What have I done? Mrs. Clump cried out in a tiny voice. And looking through one of the golden windows, the children saw her collapse in a chair before a small tin pie. She began to cut it with jerky movements as the palace door closed with a bang. At that moment, the boxes ceased to spin. The music stopped, and the attic was silent. Down from his box sprang Mr. Twigley and ran to the golden palace. With a cry of delight, he picked it up and gazed at the scene within. Very clever. I really must congratulate myself. All it needs now is a penny in the slot, and then it will do for Brighton Pier. 1 penny, only 1 penny, folks, to see the fat woman eating the pie. Roll up, only 1 penny. Waving the palace, Mr. Twigley went gaily capering round the room. Jane and Michael, leaping down from their boxes, ran after him and caught his coat-tails. They peered through the windows at Mrs. Clump. There was a look of horror on her mechanical face as she cut her mechanical pie. That was your 6th wish, Michael reminded him. It was indeed, Mr. Twigley agreed. A really useful idea for once. Where there's a wish, there's a way, you see, especially if she's around. He nodded at Mary Poppins, who was stepping off her musical box in a most majestic manner. Get your hats, please, she commanded sharply. I want to go home for a cup of tea. I am not a desert camel. Oh, just one moment, Mary Poppins. Please, oh, just one moment. Please, Mary Poppins. Mr. Twigley's got one more wish. Jane and Michael, both talking at once, were tugging at her hands. Why, so I have. I'd quite forgotten now. What shall I? Cherry Tree Lane. Remember, Fred? Mary Poppins' voice had a warning note. Oh, I'm glad you reminded me. Just a second. Mr. Twigley put his hand to his brow, and a scale of music sounded. What did you wish? Asked Jane and Michael, but Mr. Twigley seemed suddenly to have become deaf, for he took no notice of the question. He shook hands hurriedly, as though, having wished all his wishes, he was now anxious to be alone. You have to be going, you said. How sad. Is this your hat? Well, delighted you came. I hope, are these your gloves, dear Mary? I hope you'll pay me another visit when my wishes come round again. When will that be? Demanded Michael. Oh, in about 90 years or so, Mr. Twigley answered airily. But we'll be quite old by then, said Jane. Maybe, he replied with a little shrug, but at least not as old as I am. And with that he kissed Mary Poppins on both cheeks and hustled them out of the room. The last thing they saw was his jubilant smile as he began to fix a penny in the slot to Mrs. Clump's palace. And we'll pause there.